I'm John Sutkowsky from the Toby Hanna EEO office, and I'm going to talk with you about sexual harassment, and it's an annual requirement. I'm going to talk for like 15-20 minutes, and then Heather Fiedler will talk about sexual assault, and then Eva Granville will also come to talk about a couple topics too. As we go through, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand then, or speak over the mic there, and there'll also be an opportunity at the end to ask questions if you have anything at the very end. But for me, talking about sexual harassment, the first thing we're going to talk about is the two kinds of sexual harassment. One of them is called quid pro quo, and that's a fancy Latin term meaning this for that. So when it's like one thing in exchange for another. So what it means in this context is that a manager either explicitly or implicitly links something to do with work with something to do with sex. And it doesn't matter what the work thing is, whether it's an appraisal rating, a cash award, getting hired for a job. It doesn't matter about the work part, and then also the sex part, it doesn't matter either, whether it's touching, grabbing, groping, or outright sexual activity. So whenever the manager, and that slide up there has some examples of it as far as like disciplining or terminating an employee who refuses sexual advances. So if you don't date me, you're fired. You know, those sorts of things. And again, it doesn't have to be an overt thing. It could be subtle as well. So that's one kind of sexual harassment. The other kind is normally the one that people have more difficulty with because it's not as clear cut, and that's the one that can create a hostile environment. So as far as the kind of examples of things that could create a hostile environment, they are on the slide. They include verbal, nonverbal, and also some physical. As far as things that you might have heard or seen here, and not just here at work, but in your other places, or if you're looking at the news or whatever, would be people putting up inappropriate pictures at their bench or their cubicle or their workspace, sending inappropriate sexually suggestive emails, sending people texts, things like that, telling jokes at work of a sexual nature, having sexual conversations at work. Those are sort of things that can create a hostile environment. Now, the part that we're going to talk a little bit about next is, say for instance, that you didn't like traveling the globe, or you wanted to, stay in a certain work area and not have to travel a lot. So if you wanted a different kind of job and you were into EEO issues, you could say, well, hey, I'm going to try to become an EEO investigator, or I want to become an equal opportunity judge and work in Philadelphia in their district office. So let's say you make the career change, and then now all of a sudden it's time for your first case, and it's a sexual harassment complaint. So if you're the judge or the investigator, one of the things you're going to be looking at to determine if it's a hostile environment is how often is it happening? Is it happening like once a day? Is the thing happening every week, once a month, once a year? So how often is it going on? What's the frequency? And as you might expect, the more often things are going on, the more likely it could create a hostile environment. Also, we're talking severity. So we're looking at how bad is the behavior. And one example could be touching somebody on the rear end, worse than touching somebody on the elbow. Saying the F word is worse than saying a word like damn. There's a continuum from it doesn't really matter to, wow, this is the worst possible thing one human being could do to another. So where on that severity scale do these actions occur? Now, as you might imagine, if something only happens once, more likely than not, it's not going to create a hostile work environment because it's really low on the frequency scale. So it's like a one-time thing.
Hey, John, can you give me a second? Hey, all calling stations, please place your mics on mute. We're getting a little feedback. Over. Go ahead.
Okay.
Hey guys, all calling stations, put your mics on mute, please, while we hear the briefing. We'll open it up when we have questions. Over.
So normally, if something only happens one time, it's not going to create a hostile environment. And the only exception to that is if it's really, really severe. So if it happens one time, but it's really disgusting and awful, then a hostile environment can be created. But for the most part, normally you need multiple instances over a period of time in order for a hostile environment to be created. Okay, so I probably picked a situation or scenario this year from what we deal with on a normal, and when I say normal, that doesn't mean good, but on a regular basis. Let's pretend that there's a cost center in our example where there's only like guys. So maybe there's 10 or 15 men, and on a regular, everyday basis, they insult each other or use language like, on the soft end, it'd be like Nancy boy, pansy sissy, and then it could get worse from there as far as like sexually degrading language. So do you think that could create a hostile environment even if all the people who worked there were men? Or on the other hand, you think, well, there's no women, so it's not a big deal. Yeah, some of you are nodding, yeah, that could create a hostile environment. And you'd be right, because it doesn't matter who the harasser is, whether it's a man or a woman. It doesn't matter who's on the receiving end of the behavior, whether it's a man or a woman. It doesn't matter if the harasser, for instance, is gay, lesbian, or straight. And it doesn't matter if the person on the receiving end of the behavior is gay, lesbian, or straight. Sexual orientation of the individuals does not matter. Gender of the people does not matter at all. Whenever you use sexually charged words in the work environment, it could definitely create a hostile environment for people, regardless of the personal characteristics of the people who are in that cost center. And I do think that overall at Toby Hanna, one of the things that is probably it used to be, I think, our biggest problem used to be the pictures at people's benches or cubicles that people used to cut out from either, unbelievably enough, like Playboy, Hustler, Maxim, stuff from a long time ago. And one of the things is Lean sort of got rid of people's garbage from the work area on a personal basis. So I think more people are really strictly geared towards work with what is really on their bench or desk. And also magazines really don't exist anymore for the most part, and newspapers are kind of going too. So although that has definitely decreased by a wide margin, I do think this would probably be our #1 problem that we have of a sexual harassment nature. Maybe one reason people didn't realize that they were sexually harassing their coworkers, or they could be considered sexual harassment, so that's why I added this year. Does anybody have any questions so far? Nothing? Okay. Okay, so one of the things that we always talk about, which is like 3 slides away from now, would be what do you think you should do if you're getting sexually harassed? But before we get to that part, one thing I wanted to talk about was, so I'm going to say that if there was a quiz and somebody said to you, who is the most responsible person for the work environment that you work under or that you work in? So for the most part, I'd probably say the boss. Whoever the supervisor is, that person plays the biggest percentage and the biggest input into what the work environment's like. However, I think it's also a bad idea to either give that supervisor all the blame for bad stuff and also give the supervisor all the credit for all the good stuff in your work cost center. Depending on where you work, and it could be either good or bad. It's not just the supervisor, it's everybody in that cost center. So if there's like 15 workers there, all of you play a part in whether or not that place is a good place to work and a healthy place to work, or you play a part if it's a rotten, bad place to work. So one of the things that I just wanted to stress with everybody this year was the part of, you're a human being just like anybody else. If you see a problem, you should actually say to yourself, oh, yeah, Joe's harassing Sally, and you shouldn't think to yourself, oh, I'm just going to walk away and it'll stop in a while. What you might think to yourself is, wow, maybe I don't have a great relationship with Sally and she's just a coworker, but on the other hand, Sally is somebody's daughter, she's somebody's mother, she's somebody's brother or sister or whatever. She is somebody to somebody. Somebody cares about Sally, she's like a stranger to me, but if I want people to treat people I care about well when they're at work, well then maybe I should do that to other people too, because I'm sure a lot of you probably, if you've been in a work situation long enough, you've had great bosses, you've had rotten bosses, you've had fantastic coworkers, you've had rotten coworkers. And similarly, the people that you care about, whether it's your wife or your husband or your son or your daughter, they've also had great experiences wherever they work, and they probably also have rotten experiences. And nothing is worse than when your spouse or somebody comes home and tells you how no one is caring about them at their work site, and then you think to yourself, well, I wish I could go in and give them a piece of my mind. Why don't they stick up for my wife or my husband? So similarly, you could help somebody out that you work with. So intervene would be nice. And on this next slide, we give you some examples of things that you could possibly do to intervene. And these things are like a temporary basis. So this isn't going to solve the problem forever. But for instance, if you see one person doing a job on somebody else, you could sort of like try to change the subject with the harasser. And you probably know the harasser better than anybody, like what do they like to talk about? So if they like football or they're an Eagles fan or a Steeler fan, you could talk about whatever is going on that week. You could, if you know, like the Yankees and Phillies season just ended, if it was the summer, you could talk to them about how Bryce Harper was a total waste of money, and isn't it weird enough that the guy leaves his team and all of a sudden they're going to win the World Series? How does that work, Bob? You know, whatever the situation is, you could distract the person and get them off of the harassing topic and engage them in a conversation so the person being harassed can leave. So granted, it doesn't totally solve your problem forever, but at least temporarily, the guy or woman is not being harassed anymore. Similarly, what you could do is if, for instance, Rick is the person who's getting harassed, you could kind of go over and say, hey, Rick, I'm having a problem over here. Can you help me out? I think I need your help on this. And then Rick would then go over to you, and he could help you solve your fake problem, which doesn't really need to fix it. But on the other hand, Rick's not getting harassed anymore. And then when you're talking to Rick one-on-one, you know, privately, you could just say something along the lines of, you know, I know that really made me feel uncomfortable when that guy just said X, Y, and Z. You know, are you okay? Like, how are you feeling about that? And then you could actually see whether or not that person, how upset they are. And then if they are really upset, and you know, if you're really upset, then you could talk with that person about ideas on how to fix the situation or what we could do together to make the environment better, not only for the person who that time was being harassed, but for all the future people who will probably be harassed too. So it have that one-on-one dialogue with the person who's being harassed to come up with a plan. And as far as things that you could definitely do, if you're looking at, you know, like, what do you think you should do if you're being harassed? Tell the person who's doing it to stop. You know, that would be normally the #1 answer. And for the most part, it's a good idea if you have that conversation, to have that conversation with that person one-on-one privately. Because normally, like, let's pretend I'm in a group situation and somebody came over to me and said to me that, and it doesn't have to be like you offended me by doing something raunchy, sexually, racially, or whatever. They might say something like, you're the worst EEO person I've ever seen in my life. You're disgusting and awful. You give crappy briefings. You did this, that, and the other. You're a horrible human being. So normally if that happens, I might agree with them. But because they're saying it to them, saying it in public to everybody, I'm probably going to be, no matter what the truth is, I'm probably going to get my back up against the wall, and I'm going to get defensive. I'm going to argue for my case. So it's not going to really be a problem-solving thing. It's going to be me versus that person because it's in public. So no, I think in this instance, I'm like your normal everyday person where if you're going to tell me that you don't like what I'm doing in some way, it'd probably be better if you told me one-on-one, and then I would be more likely to say, yeah, that was stupid. That was awful. You know, I apologize for that, and then what can we do to make it better? Then as opposed to the public display that maybe not be as successful. But in any case, I would hope, you know, if you tell the person who's doing it to stop, they'd stop. But if they don't, you could tell your boss about it, because your supervisor is responsible for your work environment. So you can give your supervisor the opportunity to fix the situation. And then hopefully that would work. But for our purposes, we say it doesn't work. And we'll say that the harassment is continuing. Well, one of the things you could do then is contact the Equal Employment Opportunity Office. We're in Building 4, Bay 4, where the C4 ISR Directorate used to be before they moved over into Building 1 over here. We're at 7575 locally, so that's like 570-615-7575. That's our main number. Shannon Reyes is the person who talks to people. So if you want to either file a complaint right away, you want information, you want to know how stuff works, you want to, and sometimes people just feel better by having talked about it. And a lot of times if you get it off your chest, you feel better about it because you told somebody about it, and maybe she gives you some information that'll make you feel better and give you a path forward, so maybe you won't feel like you're caught in a maze anymore. But that now, on the other hand, oh, you know, I got a path forward and I got some ideas on what we could do to fix the situation. So the big part of that, 45 calendar days in which to file a complaint. So it doesn't really matter what your complaint is with regard to an equal employment opportunity complaint. And by EEO, we mean you believe you're being harassed or treated differently because of things like race, color, sex, religion, national origin, physical, mental disability, age. If you think that the bad, unfair treatment is being done to you because of one of those factors, such as like sexual harassment, then you must, if you want to file a complaint, you must do it within 45 calendar days of when the thing happened. So non-selection for a job based on age, unsatisfactory appraisal based on disability, sexual harassment, 45 days from whenever it happened, you could file a complaint about it. And you'd contact Shannon. And you know, the main number again. And you know, if you look her up, the name in the Toby Hanna email thing, you know, she's in there too. Okay, so the last slide of my portion of the presentation, we got the two categories of sexual harassment, Shannon Reyes, 7575, and then we got Heather Fiedler, sexual assault response coordinator, different phone number. And basically, if I was going to say, like, what are the differences between the two things, one of them would be that the Equal Opportunity Office handles complaints about things that happen to you while you're in your work status. So that means when you're physically, for instance, here at Toby Hanna, if you're at a forward location at your work site, that counts. Or if you're TDY somewhere, that counts. So that means you at your work location. On the other hand, what Heather Fiedler handles is a little bit different in as much as it could be things that happen to you not related to your work status at all. So it could happen when you're just living your life somewhere and something bad happens to you. Even though it didn't happen at work, you can contact her about it. And then also, if something bad would happen to someone you care about, like a spouse, a child, or like a friend, you could go to her and tell her about that person's situation, and then she could give you some guidance, tips, advice, and help regarding that other person's situation. Whereas with regard to the Equal Opportunity Office, we don't handle the like friends or close relatives. We don't handle those kind of problems with the Equal Employment Opportunity Office. So that's kind of a distinction. And then the other distinction would be EEO does handle, you know, sexual harassment can include physical things. However, the sexual assault is the more severe of the physical touching or activity. So generally speaking, a good differentiation point would be if the touching involves private areas like breasts, crotch, rear end, then that would be a sexual assault problem, as opposed to if the touching would involve things like elbow, shoulder, knee, thigh, those sort of touching, that's on the less severe side of the scale of the touching, which would more likely be the sexual harassment, not going over to sexual assault. So those are some of the differences between what our two places work on. But that's all for the prepared slides for my portion of the presentation. Does anybody have any questions either off post or on the other hand in this room? Anything that I talked about that you want clarification on or more depth about? Or on the other hand, something related to sexual harassment that I did not cover at all that you might have a question about? Nothing at all?
Any questions for John out in the field?
Okay. One thing I'll say as I take my mic off is that, you know, I do see, and granted it isn't as bad here as it was when you're over in building 2 and there's like 1,000 people there and they're all your coworkers. Definitely I would never ask a question then. You know, and all the big deal people are around and whatever. So if you are shy and for whatever reason you don't feel comfortable, because like I'm a person who doesn't like talking in public for the most part, although you wouldn't know that. In my real life, I don't like doing that. So if you would just want to ask a question and you don't want to hear other people listen in or whatever, you could definitely call Shannon, you know, the 7575 number. If she's not available, I could talk with you. So you could either drop by on a lunch or a break or call us over the phone, you know, whatever the case is, whether it's today, next week, a year from now. But thank you very much for your time.